Hello everyone. Today you are going to integrate some of the things that you've learned from your previous chapters, specifically for loops, and we're going to integrate them with some logic from if statements. Now, the point of this is to show you how you can bridge some of these learnings together to start to make code that is not only dynamic, it can change based on the information that you're processing within it, but also can be done in an automatic way that is really, really fast. So this is mostly intended to show you how you should start thinking about putting all of these different building blocks together, because in the next section, or rather the next chapter, I'm going to introduce some practical things that are going to make your code more efficient and run smoothly, and will make your code actually make it possible to code large lines of text and use scripts and editors, and then actually jump into some real data science stuff. So you're starting to get to the point where you learned enough that you're going to be able to apply this. So I'm hoping by the end of this lecture you can start to think about ways to integrate your learning going forward. So what you're going to learn today is you're going to learn about integrating for loops with if statements. We're also going to learn about looping statements, these continue, break, and pass commands. And these commands, what they're designed to do is to manipulate how your iterations are going. I'll show you what each of them actually does, but that's essentially what they're designed to do. They're designed to manipulate how the iterations are going on. Lastly, I'm going to introduce you to the range function, which is just a way to build a finite set of numbers in a list in Python. It's a simple function, but it'll be useful for the demo and example. So the definitions that you need to know are, what are these three loop statement stuff? So the first one is continue. So you can only use these loop statements if you are in a loop. Like if you're in a for loop or a while loop, they won't work if you're in like a if you're in anything else. Like they're designed specifically for looping. The first one, continue. If your Python code comes across a continue, either through an if statement or at the end of a line somewhere, what it will do is it tells the loop, even if there is more code to be run underneath the for loop or the continue statement, it's like still embedded within the for loop, it will stop right there and continue to the next iteration. The break statement, when it reaches the break statement, what it'll do is, rather than moving to the next iteration, it'll simply stop all for the remaining iterations in that for loop and move on to the next line of unindented code. So it breaks your for loop. That's kind of what it's trying to say. And lastly, we have the pass statement. This pass statement is a placeholder when you so if you're building out complex logic and you have like these functions and you're doing things one at a time, and you want to be able to catch some information, but you don't want to build out the logic around it, like what you want to do and process with it. You can use the pass statement, which just simply allows you to say, okay, like it was caught, but I'm not going to do anything with this condition. Okay. So with that in mind, guys, let's jump into some syntax and let's do this one step at a time and show you how we're going to integrate for loops and if statements with these loop statements that will influence how your code iterates. Okay, so first thing we have here, you see our first line here is that range function I mentioned to you before. So let me just bring up what this range function is doing. You can also look at this in the Python documentation as well, but what range does is it's going to create a list of numbers that start from a number that you give it and end just before the number that you provide in the next parameter in the next comma here. So what this is saying is I want a list of numbers between 0 and 10. This final parameter tells you what your step size is. So this is trying to tell you, okay, so I want from 0 to 10 in steps of 1. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. If I put in 2 here, it would go 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Makes sense? Okay, that's essentially what it's doing though. So we have this response is effectively a list. Even though you don't see it as a list, we haven't preserved or saved it as a list variable. It is in fact a list, and when we go into our Python terminal, we'll see how this outputs. So we don't necessarily need variables to iterate over, so long as the output of a function is the appropriate type. You can skip creating variables altogether. So remember, this is our for loop syntax. So in order to do a for loop, we go for. I used a poor variable name here, but I wanted to illustrate this as a point. for x in our range of lists. So for each number in this range list that we've just made, like specifically within this line, and then we have our colon at the end to tell our Python code that this is the end of our for loop syntax and that everything else that is going to be done in this for loop is going to be indented. You see how everything here is indented? That means that this entire set of code is going to run on each for loop iteration. So this element here from 0, 1, 2, all the way to 10. Okay, so now what you see here in our second line is that we have an if statement, if, elif, and else statement specifically here that has a bunch of different logic. The if statement is, here's our syntax here, so if logical statement, and this has to be true in order for this code to run. This is saying if our element here, modulo 2 has 0 remainder, then we want it to print something. And you see that second indent here because this is we want this to run only if the if statement is true. We need you see the colon here, so it has the indentation, and we need that in order to tell Python what to actually do if this statement becomes true. We then have another elif statement. Well, we have another if statement, but all subsequent if statements are elif or else if statements. And this one is saying if x is 3, then print 3, like print this thing here, as well as the x variable, and then break, okay? So remember what break does. If this condition is passed, this for loop will end, and it might end early. We have to think about when it's going to end in this case. Obviously, it's going to end once this iteration gets to 3. And then we have our else statement here. And what this else statement is just saying is, we're not going to do anything here, but we could have it like print something if we wanted to later on, but we just haven't decided on some logic for it. So otherwise, it's going to do nothing in this case. So only if these two conditions are met will it print anything. All right? Does that all make sense? So now what we're going to do is we're going to hop into terminal, and we're going to see how this all works. All right? Okay, so here we are. We're going to go into Python. I just cleared out our screen there, guys, so no worries. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to check out that range function. Let's see if we just do help range. See if it, there we go. So here range says you give it a start and a stop, and it returns an object that reproduces a sequence of integers from the start to stop by step j, as you see here, step j. Okay? So let's just play with that and see what we got. Actually, let's one more look here. Let's see if there are additional parameters that we can add to it. We can have it count or index. Those are things that we don't really want right now. So let's just do our example here. Range 0 to 11 in step of 1. It gives you an object, which is a range object, which is 0 and 1. Remember how in Python we can force typing? So sometimes you can turn an integer into a float, or a float into a string by using these force commands. Like they're like a function that will try and convert something. If we convert that into a list, you in fact see what we have there. Okay, those are the list numbers for that range object. Let's try with this stepwise too. And there you have it. This range object indeed is a list that contains those numbers. So like we could still use this for our for loop because the output is in fact a list. Okay, so let's build our for loop for x in range 0 to 11 with a step size of 1. And what do we need to do now that we have completed our for loop syntax? We have to indent, or we have to colon, and then indent. We know that we built this right because Python is waiting for more information. We're going to do an if statement now. So if x modulo 2 equals 0, and we have that colon because now this logical statement is complete. So if this rings true, we want it to do something. We have to do double indents, remember, because we have to indent for the for loop, but we're also now giving it the commands for what to do in the if statement. So we're going to go print x, and then we'll just say even. And we know this isn't even because modulo 2, if you have a 0 remainder, that means it's an even number. We're now going to include the elif statement, which is one indent because we've completed our if statement. So the indentation is gone for that if statement, so we're back to 1. So elif x equals 3, We're going to double indent again because now we're dealing with the elif statement within the for loop, x, and we'll put 3. And what we're going to do with this one is break afterwards. And else pass. See all that there? We had 2 indentations for our if statements because they were indented from the for loop. You notice that I have 2 commands here for the elif. We can have many, many more commands if we wanted. And otherwise, we have this else statement here that we're passing on. So what will happen when we run this? What do you guys expect to happen? Do you think we'll get all the way to 10? See if you can guess where we'll end up when this thing happens. Because, like, look, we have this break command. Maybe we won't get to the break command, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so in this case, look what happened here. First, it doesn't print 1. Why? Because 1 is not modulo 2 equals 0 and is not 3, so it hit pass. But when it hit 3, it broke. We didn't get the rest of the range. We didn't get 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8. What happens when we do this with continue instead? Let's just press up on all this to get all this code back. 3. And instead we're going to continue here. Continue, else, pass. There we go. So what do we expect to happen here? It goes all the way to 10. All right? But even that's because once we hit this elif, it continued, so it meant it stopped this iteration and went back to the top. If we had more code here, like after this else statement, we had it print like iteration over, it wouldn't print iteration over on this if it hit 3. We can even like show you that if you'd like. But maybe we'll show you that in another lecture because we're getting short on time here, guys. So that is how you integrate for loops and if statements. Let's do a quick recap. So you learned how to use for loops and if statements. You learned how to deal with the loop statements, the continue, break, and pass features. And you also learned a little bit about the range functions. So in your next lectures, guys, you notice that we're starting to like build code that has like at least 10 lines in it. That starts to get really difficult and tiring when you're building code that has hundreds of lines. So your next chapter is going to be all about how to deal with building a large code base. Your first lectures are going to be about how to learning how to script in Python, but then you're going to also learn a little bit about how to build functions that like will reduce the amount of code that you're writing and optimize it so that you're writing, you know, really efficient, sleek code. So thanks very much, guys. Looking forward to seeing you in the next chapter.